Our speaker today is Andrea Currie, who is the author of this fabulous book that's on sale at the back. It's called Finding Otipemisiwak. Otipemisiwak, no, it's Wook at the end. Otipemisiwak. The people who own themselves. That's the emphasis. The people who own themselves. You'll love this book. You will learn so much from it. And we're so lucky that we have Andrea with us today. Many will remember Andrea Currie from For the Moment. Remember that fabulous group in the 80s, the 90s, the early thousands? She's still a musician, but she has many, many other roles. She's a mother, a psychotherapist, a community builder, a learner, a teacher, and an elder. Today, she will read, speak, answer questions, and I hope sing to us. So welcome, Andrea Currie.
Thank you so much, Margie. Such a gracious introduction. And I want to begin also honoring the people of the land we're on, the lands we're on, the Mi'kmaq. And I'm going to do that by singing a couple of rounds of the honor song. The words, probably many of you have heard the honor song before. I learned it from elders in the community of Wegelma, where I worked as a community-based therapist for 15 years and co-founded a women's hand drumming group called Wegelma Uiskwa, which means the women of Wegelma. And so I learned the songs from the elders, and the words mean, let us honor our ancestors, let us honor our nativeness. And whenever we would sing in groups where there were people who weren't of Mi'kmaq ancestry, we would say, this is for everybody to honor where you came from and your own ancestors. And also let us help one another. It's basically what the words mean. And there are usually 4 rounds. It's quite a long song. And today, as I've also been given permission to do by those who taught it to me, I'm just going to sing two rounds. And we begin with 4 beats, which are the honor beats, sort of calling in the 4 directions. And if you're able to stand as you are able. And I don't see any hats on, but we always say to remove hats, so we're good. So. Ouch. Gesud migaluk sigulas is ham hey hey Sudaligaluk sigula sithamuk hey 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 oh hey hi way oh hey hi way oh hey hey oh hey hi way oh hey hi hey oh. Be seated. So I'm Red River Métis. And though I was born on the traditional homeland of my people in Winnipeg, Manitoba, I was removed from my family at birth and grew up without any connection to them or our culture. This was part of the 60s scoop when thousands of Indigenous children were removed from our communities and placed in white families. I wrote this book to contribute to the conversation that needs to happen about the impact of the 60s scoop on people like me and our families. I want to just provide a little bit of context. This is different than other readings I've done. I've been given 45 minutes to work with here, and I don't want to just read to you. I think that would be very boring, and so I'm trying to integrate a little bit of some recorded songs that the lyrics of which are in the book, and that I recorded for the audiobook, which I also narrated. But I was lucky enough to, I still work with a group of amazing residential school survivors from Wegoma First Nation in Cape Breton in Unama'ki. And so this group of people has been really amazing teachers for me. And one of them, who has since crossed over to spirit, was the late Grand Chief Ben Syliboy. And we, over time, they were able to find the courage, we were able to find the opportunities for them to go out and speak about their experience. And Ben always said that it was really important to situate what they were talking about, and therefore what I'm going to talk about today, in the context of all the historical colonial interventions that have constituted an ongoing assault on Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. And so I'm going to do an overview, which is just kind of listing some of those things. Every single thing I mention bears further learning and exploration, and I encourage you to, if you're interested, to look into those things more. But to see where the 60s scoop fits in to that picture. So with contact came diseases. They say that in the first 2 generations after contact, 90 to 95% of all the Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island died. So there was an enormous loss of life and just a diminishment of the numbers of Indigenous peoples and the communities on these lands. Of course, then there was famine, there was war as the colonizers continued to encroach. The loss of land carries with it enormous, enormous grief that we are still trying to resolve. And what happened with all of these things happening so in such close succession is that it was very difficult to process and grieve properly. In 1876, we had the Indian Act that kind of legislated poverty, really, that we're still dealing with. It's still with us today. Then there were also relocations. In Mi'kma'ki, there was centralization. Very few people know that the reasons Sebekanekadi, Shubenacadie on the mainland and Eskasoni in Unama'ki are so big is because in the 1940s, the federal government tried to force all the communities in Unama'ki to move to Eskasoni, and all the communities on the mainland to move to Sebekanekadi. And Mi'kmaq people would never have lived in groups of 4,000. The land wouldn't support that. Communities are 600 to 800, 900. And some communities were destroyed completely. In Wagelma, like they would burn down the churches and the school and, just destroy the communities. In Wagelma, a group of people, well, it's a big, long story, but they eventually were able to speak to the Archbishop in Antigonish and ask him not to burn down their church. And he was so impressed with them because they had to make 2 trips where they walked 12 miles to the local train in Orangedale, went to visit him the first time, were turned away at the door because they didn't have an appointment, had to go all the way back home, connect with a settler friend in the settler town that is now Waikagama, ask him to write a letter for them, and then walk back the 12 miles to the train station and go back to Antigonish. And at that point, the bishop was so impressed that he said not only would he not burn down the church, but that he would never make a decision about the church and their community without consulting them. So these are stories of resilience that people don't know, but it's really important to recognize the struggles to keep communities and culture intact over the years. So of course we know then residential schools came in Sibanakadi through the 1920s into 1967, I think was when it closed. And after that came the 60 scoop. So when residential schools became unacceptable to the Canadian public, the project of assimilation didn't end. It morphed into the child welfare system. And the 60 scoop happened. And then when that became, in the 70s and 80s, Indigenous nations, including my Métis Nation, created our own child and family services agencies and tried to meet the needs of children at risk within our communities. But it then has moved into the disproportionate number of our children in child welfare in the system now, as well as incarcerated, police killings and harassment, and ongoing racism. So we're still living, we don't call this historic trauma because it's still going on. We call it colonial trauma, and we're still living in a colonial relationship here in the land we now call Canada. So that's kind of the context. And of course, there's a lot of intergenerational trauma from all of this, but there's also intergenerational healing. And this is part of it. And my son writing and performing about his experience as a descendant is part of it. So there is a lot of healing happening. I also need to acknowledge that I wouldn't have written this story and we wouldn't be having this conversation if the residential school survivors in this country hadn't broken the trail. They have created space now for us for many people to come forward and tell their stories. So I just need to honor them, and we all owe them a debt of gratitude for that courage. And then before I start reading, this is a book that I'm currently in a book club to read, and I highly recommend it. It's Jody Wilson-Raybould, her latest, and with a co-author, Roshan Danesh. And it's called Reconciling History, A Story of Canada. And it really is the voices of many people, Indigenous and settler, woven together to retell the story of the history of this country. But there was a paragraph that when I read it, it spoke to me. I just thought it was such a concise description of how the transmission of knowledge and culture has been lost, because this is her upbringing. She says, "Ever since I was a child, I have heard about the history of my people. This is, of course, an innately human thing. Children are raised to know where they have come from. This is part of how we form our identities and preserve and pass on knowledge and teachings. We all come from peoples with pasts, presents, and a future. We all have knowledge passed on to us about our people, and with it, a responsibility to share that knowledge with generations to come. Transmitting this history helps us be connected across generations and rooted to the communities, cultures, and ways of life that are vital to shaping who we are and how we live our lives." So in a nutshell, that's what 60 Scoop survivors didn't have. So I'm going to begin with excerpts from a piece called Rob's first arrival. Whenever I am asked about my earliest memory, I see myself standing beside my adoptive mother in front of the picture window in our house on Oakdean Boulevard, looking out. My older brother was standing there with us, neither of us old enough to be in school yet. I was glued to my spot, watching with intense anticipation, that feeling still so vivid, for the 1960s station wagon, a big boat of a car with wood paneling on the sides, driven by the social worker who was bringing my little brother Rob to live with us. It was the spring of 1964. I was 3 years old and Rob was 2. I was the second child our parents adopted. He was the third and last. I adored him. We had already met, of course, on previous visits, but this was the big day. The little boy we called Robbie back then was coming to stay. Robbie's favorite toy to play with when he came for visits was a rocking horse made by our adoptive dad. As soon as I saw the station wagon pull into our driveway, I turned and ran down to the family room in the basement, standing 2 feet off the ground with rockers about 2.5 feet long. The solid wooden rocking horse was almost as big as I was and definitely heavier. Still, with determination and strength fueled by adrenaline, like a mother whose child is pinned under a car, I hauled and pulled and bumped the rocking horse up the stairs, bringing it to the living room so it would be there when Robbie walked in the front door. I got about halfway up the flight of stairs before I just couldn't go any farther. I didn't have the strength to get it all the way up to the main floor, and I knew I couldn't let it go. I was stuck. I hollered to my mom to come and help me. She did. Overruling my plan and my protests, she took the rocking horse back downstairs and left it there, and we returned to the living room to welcome Rob. There is something about that moment that distills the 48 years of my relationship with Rob before he crossed over to spirit at the age of 50. That scene has a holographic quality, every element, every dimension of our relationship contained within it. The way his vulnerability reached into the deepest places in me, the way we understood each other, the unbreakable bond that sustained us through years of abuse and made us lifelong allies, the way I reached beyond reason to do whatever I could for him, my powerlessness. We were 2 Métis 60 Scoop adoptees. Our older brother, also adopted, was of European descent. For reasons I don't even want to get my head around, there was a disparity in our childhoods. Our older brother's was not punctuated by abuse. It was Robbie and I who were not pleasing to our parents. We were still quite young, though I don't recall exactly how old, when we acknowledged this shared experience. It was like that song on Sesame Street about one of these things is not like the others, except with us, there were 2 that didn't belong. Try as we might, and we both did, we tried hard, we didn't fit in. I remember feeling anguish before I knew what it was, the feeling of not being the daughter my mother wanted, at a loss as to what I could do about it. And Rob, well, it was years later in therapy when I realized that witnessing our mother's emotional and psychological cruelty toward him, as well as both parents physically assaulting him, is the source of severe trauma I am still trying to heal from. My deepest grief wears his name. Recently, I heard Jenny Hayun Wills read an excerpt from her award-winning memoir, Older Sister Not Necessarily Related, in which she shares the story of her reunion with the South Korean family she lost touch with when she was transnationally adopted. Wills teaches American literature and writing at the University of Winnipeg. She also teaches critical race studies, so her thinking on the topic of adoption, including her own, is informed by the recognition that racism is pervasive in society, embedded in and perpetuated by every institution. In the interview after her reading, Will spoke about the dominant narratives of adoption and how they don't reflect the range of experiences of adoptees. Narratives like, it didn't matter to our parents who we, the adoptees, were or where we came from because they just wanted to help. Or this one, adoption is a blessing for those of us lucky enough to be chosen. Wills talked about how it actually isn't like that for a lot of adoptees, how some of us felt like props in the lives that our white middle-class adoptive parents were determined to construct. Hearing that was like being hit by a Mack truck. Rob and I were the props that didn't behave properly. Janine Carrière, scholar and professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Victoria, states in her study on the importance of cultural planning when Indigenous children are being adopted that connection to one's family and community is needed for healthy identity development in general, as well as for racial identity development. Raven Sinclair, a scholar and social work professor at the University of Regina, recommends that when a non-Indigenous family adopts an Indigenous child, the entire family should shift its identity to become bicultural, seeking relationships with the Indigenous community their adopted child comes from, and learning teachings from that nation that will enrich all members of the adoptive family. Carrière states that cultural plans and the adoptions of Indigenous children help to end the mass emotional and psychological trauma children are experiencing when they are not connected to their culture. This much needed development in responding to the needs of Indigenous adoptees did not come soon enough for Rob and me. Our parents expected us to assimilate easily into their world, and when we did not, the problems that ensued were not interpreted with any sociocultural awareness, but were seen by them to be due to personal deficiencies in us that it was their job to correct, usually with harsh discipline that morphed over time into physical and emotional abuse. I wonder now how much I understood that this would be the case back there on that day of Rob's arrival, my earliest memory. At 3, had I already been hit and hurt by our adoptive parents? Was I already scared of them? Probably. I remember witnessing our parents being extremely violent with Rob during his preschool years. How much of my own experience was woven into my overwhelming need to help him feel safe and know that he belonged, know that someone had really seen him, enough to want his favorite toy to be the first thing he saw when he walked through our door on the day he came to stay. We heard the sound of 2 doors closing, one after the other, and then the doorbell rang. The social worker came in, Robbie's small hand clasped tightly in hers. He was wearing shorts with a little polo shirt tucked in at the waistband and special shoes that didn't look very comfortable. There was a baffled look on his face, a sweetness I would come to cherish, and just the hint of a tentative smile. So I'm going to fast forward a bit to when I left home, which I did at the age of 17, after our parents had given Rob back to the Child Welfare Agency when he was 15, making home even less bearable for me. Huge, profound loss in my life, but we did stay in touch, as the book will kind of trace our relationship over the years. But this is a poem about when I left home, called When She Was White. When she was white, she smiled as best she could, tilting her head to one side in every photograph, making her body into a question mark. When she was white, she peered through the slats of her solitude at the planet she had landed on. She prepared to retrace her steps. What she needed was easy to carry, her story, her song, her medicine, truth, revealed to her by its absence in the cracks, in the hard earth, a parched silence. As soon as she left, her spirit guides began to appear. On trains, they let her nestle into their shoulders and sleep. In boarding houses, they stared at her over cups of strong tea, the canned milk making sticky rings on the vinyl tablecloth. They gave her rides home in their police cars. They let her stay with them in their convents. They sunned themselves next to her on beaches and sat beside her on long Greyhound bus rides. They refracted the little light she needed and steadied her as she dangled in the dark space between two worlds. I'm going to fast forward again and read a piece about the day I met my oldest sister in my birth family. It's called Wolf, Come In. No family is perfect. My birth family, like so many families, contains a mix of love and pain, of strong bonds and broken relationships. Over time, these have shifted as some fences are mended and as people drift apart or choose distance. The summer I met my family for the first time, a couple of my siblings who lived in Winnipeg were not in touch with our mother. It was always a challenge to try to find a balance between respecting those siblings' choices and honoring my right to meet them all and make my own decisions. That first day with Mama, it was clear to me that she was nervous that I would be meeting my sister who lived in Winnipeg. She hinted that I would be told things about her that were not very nice. That was the closest she ever came to acknowledging her failings as a mother when my oldest 5 siblings were little kids. To say she neglected them in their early years does not adequately describe what went on. Eventually, they were apprehended by the local child welfare agency, separated, and sent to different foster homes. I told Mama what I told them all. I had missed out on knowing my family for close to half my life, and I wanted to meet and get to know them all on my own terms. In the days before my trip to Winnipeg that summer, I had been asked by my friend Rita McCoe to help her out with one of her art projects. Rita is an installation artist whose work comes from a seemingly boundless imagination. Before I met her, I experienced one of her pieces in a Halifax gallery. She had built a house that we walked through, listening to sounds coming through speakers embedded in the walls. The piece critiqued domestic violence against women. The house represented a home where a woman had been beaten. Working off the expression, if only these walls could speak, Rita had given the walls voice. It was eerie and powerful. I met Rita in the 1980s through our involvement in the peace movement. She asked me to be part of a number of her art installations as a singer, including one she was working on in the summer of 1998. Just before my trip to Winnipeg to meet my family. She was really happy for me and coincidentally would be heading there too to install her latest art piece in a location on the outskirts of the city. She asked if I had time before I left to record some vocals for it. Always glad to be involved in anything Rita was doing, I agreed to meet her in her studio on Barrington Street a few days before my flight out west. She gave me a note as a starting point and asked me to riff on it in a minor key. It didn't take long, and we were both pleased with the outcome. We wished each other well in our respective summer adventures and said goodbye. On the day I was to meet my oldest sister for the first time, I phoned her and we made a plan to meet downtown. She is a well-known and highly respected visual artist in the Winnipeg arts community, and we were going to see some of her pieces at the Niganan Center, an Indigenous community center located in the old Canadian Pacific Railway station on North Main. But first, we were going to meet outside the coffee shop where my nephew was working so I could meet him too. I arrived at the address in Winnipeg's trendy Exchange District at the agreed upon time. I had no trouble recognizing my sister from the photos I had seen. She is tall, a statuesque beauty. We embraced, then stood on the sunny sidewalk in the glow of the moment, beginning a conversation that would continue for years. My sister suggested we go inside so I could meet her son. We entered the coffee shop and I saw him, the barista, on duty behind the counter, busy serving a customer. In that same glance, I saw my friend Rita. Before I could ask her what she was doing there, she grinned from ear to ear, rubbed my arm, and exclaimed over and over, "Look who your sister is! Look who your sister is!" My world imploded. I was completely disoriented and overwhelmed. Looking back, I hope my nephew felt how happy I was to meet him. He served me coffee as time and space collapsed, and what I had thought were completely separate parts of my life came together in front of my eyes, forming a fascinating and beautiful scene. Not only did my sister and Rita know each other, they had collaborated on artworks in the past. In fact, my sister had sewn the costumes that the performers would wear to bring to life Rita's newest installation, the same one I'd made the recording for before leaving on that trip. My sister and I worked on the same art project before we even met. From that astounding beginning, we shared so much. Our political perspectives on the depth and breadth of the damage caused by colonization, the power of cultural practices to heal us, a love of being in the bush and harvesting traditional medicines, a passion for singing and drumming. A few days later, she took me to a ceremony where she invited me to sing with her. I learned my first Anishinaabe song that day, the Wolf Song. Wolf is a teacher, running some distance in front of the pack to bring back knowledge of what lies ahead. My oldest sister was my first teacher in the traditional ways of my people. I could not have hoped for more. Mayingana bindige, mayingana bindiga. Wolf, come in. So I'm going to break from reading now and play a song. I was lucky enough to narrate the audiobook of this book, and I decided to include a couple of bonus tracks of music, songs that I wrote, the lyrics of which are in the book. And yeah. There we go. My phone is over here. I decided not to sing and accompany myself playing the guitar because my guitar playing is not really performance caliber, and I was fortunate enough to have my dear friend Scott McMillan record the guitar playing on these tracks. So it's much better for you to be hearing Scott play. And is my mic still on? When I met my mother, she told me that in the Métis community, they refer to the adoptees lost through the 60 scoop as lost moccasins. And that's the name of this song. A baby girl left to find her way. A miracle of birth betrayed her. And somewhere out there, a mother prays. She's in the hands of the Creator. Questions coming as she grows, answers she may never know. Lost moccasin. I know it's hard to trust. Lost moccasin, lost moccasin. Girl trying to find her place along a path she cannot follow. And every day she wears a happy face, although inside she feels so whole. Searching for a ray of light, how to make this come out right. Lost moccasin, you've got to sing your song. Lost moccasin, move on. She followed her dreams right up town. She rode the what goes around must surely come around. It must surely come around.
Young woman now out on the road. So many places she could go. So many things that she needs to unload. So many things she wants to know. Then one day she gets a call. Magic happens after all. Lost moccasin, lost moccasin. There's nowhere left to go. Lost moccasin, come home. So she followed her dreams that town. She rode the rails and the greyhound, knowing that what goes around surely comes around. It most surely comes around. A woman now with a baby boy, and their true home is with each other. No gift more precious, no greater joy. She gives thanks for being a mother. Answers she can give her child, how he came to be so wild. Lost moccasin, coming home at last. Lost moccasin, stop running so fast. Lost moccasin, be peace with their past. Lost moccasin, come home, come home, come home.
We'll continue with a few more readings. That's okay. Just a couple more, actually. So the poem, the book is a mix of sort of memoir pieces, poetry, and essays. And this is one of the essays, and it's on cultural blindness. Pelicans are synchronized swimmers. They glide by in a V with its open end forward, the broad white bowls of their bodies stabilizing their curving necks, their long, slender beaks equipped with a light orange pouch underneath. I loved sitting on the dock at the family cottage, watching as their webbed feet propelled them forward in the gray-green water of Netley Creek at exactly the same pace as each other, 5 or 7 of them swimming as one, poetry in motion. Collaboration is their nature. They follow schools of fish, enclosing them and narrowing the opening until the moment they all plunge in their beaks and feed. A shared harvest. A oneness expressed in the practicalities of everyday life. They make kinship look so easy and beautiful. I had come to the cottage at Netley for a few days after a week in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins taking a course called Indigenous Social Determinants of Health. Having received a fellowship in a 3-year program of study for Indigenous health practitioners starting in 2007, each summer I was flown to different locations on Turtle Island to gather with Indigenous colleagues from Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, and Central America for 1 week. My cohort and teachers were an amazing array of leaders in Indigenous health. Among them were trailblazers from many Indigenous nations in Canada and the US, Maori knowledge carriers and frontline workers, community-based primary health workers from rural and remote places in Central America. Even the president of the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association attended. Their collective wisdom was powerful. Being together gave us a direct experience of our shared reality. The different contexts we were working in were globally connected. Indigenous peoples all over the world are healing from colonization. We swam in synchrony for 1 week each summer, first in Baltimore, then in Banff, then in New York City, immersed in a sea of traditional and Western knowledge, collectively generating and harvesting the wisdom that fed our souls and our professional practices. We spent most of our time in each other's company. We learned as a family. Subsequent summers, we greeted each other with the joy of kin reconnecting after not having seen each other for a while. After my week in Baltimore, I flew to Winnipeg to visit my families, but first I headed straight to the cottage for the first few days to work on a paper I had to complete as a course requirement. I had a few days alone there to write. Then Uncle Derry and Aunt Charlene came out and hosted a dinner, a kind gesture that allowed me to see a lot of Currie family relatives at once. I watched my cousin's children race to see who would be the first one on the tire swing, just like we had when we were their age. Uncle Derry was a gracious host. There were 14 of us in total, and the meal was a sit-down dinner with every table in the place lined up end to end, stretching from the windows facing the water almost all the way to the back wall. The conversation was lively. I was quiet. My heart was in my community of Wegoma, which I was writing about. My thoughts were with my Indigenous health colleagues. I had been writing for days about all the factors that contributed to the disproportionately high rates of physical and mental illness in our communities. My body was at the table, but my spirit was with my people. I realized then that this family didn't really know me anymore, with the exception of Uncle Derry and Charlene. Those two had made a point of accompanying me on this wild ride of discovery, because they wanted to support me, but also because they wanted to learn themselves. It wasn't that my other relatives were unkind. I looked around at these good people whom I had known through my growing up years and felt a profound disconnect. I realized that my reality, Indigenous reality, the Métis and Mi'kmaq communities I was part of, and the international community of Indigenous health practitioners were just beyond the scope of my Currie family's knowledge. "Why were you in Baltimore, Andrea?" my cousin asked. "I was part of a group of Indigenous peoples from around the world taking a course on Indigenous social determinants of health," I replied, grateful to be asked. "Well, that sounds interesting. Was that your first time in Baltimore? What did you think of the city?" My words dissolved in my throat. I was ready to describe the learning community we had created, eager to share the insights I had gained. My family seemed more interested in whether or not I had had a feed of crab. This cousin just didn't know what they didn't know, so they had no questions to ask. Years earlier rather, they were happy to hear that I had reconnected with my birth family, but once they had expressed that, the conversation had been over. Sitting next to them at the table, elbow to elbow, I felt very far away. I was raised to be polite. I carried myself well that evening, showing genuine interest in what was going on in their lives, laughing and carrying on, but I felt invisible. I had to put back on the same costume I had worn for the first 17 years of my life to try to fit in. I looked like the same person they had always known. The fact that I had never really been that person was lost on them. That was the only version of me they knew, the only version they could relate to. Despite being surrounded by people whom I was expected to relate to as family, I felt invisible and lonely. The next day, Uncle Derry and I were talking. He asked me if I had enjoyed the family gathering. Our relationship has always been strong enough to hold honesty and complexity, so I told him the truth. It was good to see everyone and hear how they were doing, but I didn't feel at home among them anymore. I was different now in ways that my adoptive family could not see. It wasn't that they didn't want to. It was just that growing up in and being part of the dominant culture had left them with only their own reference points for understanding their own reality and the realities of others. This has a name: cultural blindness. According to the American Psychology Association's Dictionary of Psychology, cultural blindness is the inability to understand how particular matters might be viewed by people of a different culture because of a rigid adherence to the views, attitudes, and values of one's own culture, or because the perspective of one's own culture is sufficiently limiting to make it difficult to see alternatives. Uncle Derry was compassionate. He went further in his effort to understand, asking me what was most powerful for me in the process of reclaiming my Métis identity. He commented on the relationships I had created with members of my birth family, recognizing how this must have been very healing for me. I told him that yes, reconnecting with my mother, my siblings, my extended Métis family had been profound, so much so that I would never be able to find adequate words to describe it. But that was not the most powerful part of the experience. I told him that most powerful for me was reconnecting with my culture. The look on his face showed bafflement. He thought for a few seconds, then said, "Really? Imagine culture being more important than family." A light bulb came on in my mind in that instant. I saw, in its glare, cultural blindness. How one of the most intelligent, compassionate, well-informed, socially conscious people I have ever met could not grasp that culture could be more important than family to anyone, to me. I saw how hard it can be for settler people to really understand how culture is our lifeblood, how it shapes and holds us, teaches and guides us, heals and supports and comforts us, because their culture permeates our collective life so thoroughly that they never even have to think about it, to the point that they are not even aware of how steeped they are in their own culture, nor of how embedded it is in the structure of every institution, and how most of society reinforces and perpetuates its dominance so it is always there for them. How can a person whose culture has been dominant for centuries, without continuous attempts to attack it, eradicate it, denigrate it, and assimilate it into another culture, without its being despised and reduced to a fraction of its former self, truly understand the deep value of culture? Those of us who have had our cultures ripped from us, beaten out of us, who have heard hateful things said about our cultures throughout the centuries since contact with the Europeans, who have watched our languages dwindle to rare whispers, who have watched the lands and waters that are part of us be exploited and ruined, who have had to fight to save what's left of our cultures and revitalize as much of what has been lost as we can, we know how important culture is. If you want to understand the importance of culture, try to imagine living without yours if you can. What would you have lost? Who would you be? And one last piece. One of the threads throughout the book, and I think of it as like a Métis sash, it has many threads. There's stories about my growing up, there's stories about Rob, and there are lots of pieces about the rivers in Manitoba that are very important to me. And this is one of those pieces, excerpts from it. It's about my great-great-grandfather, who was a well-known leader in the time of the provisional government. Anyway, I'll just tell you the story. In 1869, Elzéar was a hardworking Métis man with a growing family, living in the bush not far from the Red River settlement. He was the mail courier between the settlement and a community to the south known as Pembina. He traveled back and forth on the Crow Wing Trail by dog sled in the winter and on horseback the rest of the year. He was the Pony Express, my mother said, laughing. Trouble was coming to the settlement. The government of John A. Macdonald had tried to install a governor in the territory, but the Métis prevented William McDougall from coming in. Macdonald intended to annex the territory, which they called Rupert's Land, into Confederation and encourage more settlement. This plan did not go over well with those who already lived there. The Hudson's Bay Company not only presided over the fur trade, but provided a form of civic government as well. The Métis felt that was as much government as they needed. When the company sold Rupert's Land to the colonial government and surveyors arrived to stake out claims, a Métis militia began to take shape. Elzéar joined other men in the community who would ride over on horseback to tell the newcomers that the land they were marking off was already occupied. It was a logical step for Elzéar to become involved with Riel's provisional government. In fact, he was a natural leader and a favorite of Riel's, who made him second in command of the Métis militia at Fort Garry. In the course of his duties, Elzéar participated in the arrest, detention, trial, and execution of Thomas Scott, a settler of Irish descent and an Orangeman. The Orangemen were infamous for their hatred of Catholics, the French, and Indigenous peoples, which added up to 3 strikes against the Métis. After publicly and persistently boasting of his plan to murder Riel during the time of the provisional government, Scott was charged with treason. Riel was not part of the military tribunal that tried Scott and found him guilty. My great-great-grandfather, however, was a member of that tribunal and of the firing squad that carried out the execution. Whatever one might think today of the decision to execute Scott, there is no doubt in my mind that my ancestor acted out of his commitment to protect our people and our homeland during a time of great unrest. Meanwhile, John A. Macdonald, at the same time that he was pretending to negotiate with Riel on terms that would be acceptable to the Métis for our territory to become part of Canada, sent the Wolseley expedition, a force of 2,000 British soldiers and volunteers, to put down what is referred to by the colonizers as the Red River Rebellion, and by my people as the Red River Resistance. When knowledge of the approaching army reached Riel and the other members of the provisional government, they knew that the negotiations had been a sham and that they would be massacred if they stayed to try to hold the fort. The leaders of the provisional government dispersed, seeking safety in the short term, but not losing sight of their long-term vision of self-government. Riel went into hiding and others laid low, but Elzéar, for whatever reason, perhaps because he had a wife and 5 children to take care of with a 6th on the way, went back to delivering the mail. In September 1870, with Wolseley's men milling around the settlement, pumped up for a battle that had never happened, Elzéar went into the Red Saloon in Winnipeg to pick up the mail to be delivered to Winnipeg, to Pembina. Inside, he was recognized by some of the soldiers who shouted and gave chase, threatening to lynch him. My great-great-grandfather ran out and down the road, now Lombard Avenue, to the river, where he jumped in and began to swim across to the St. Boniface side. The mob began throwing rocks at him, one of which hit him on the head and knocked him unconscious. He drowned. He was 34 years old. His body was recovered the following day. No charges were ever laid. Nobody ever held accountable for his murder. His death marked the beginning of what has gone down in history as the reign of terror against the Red River Métis. If a Métis person showed their face on the west side of the river, they were in danger. Many of our people were beaten and raped. In 2008, Parc Commémoratif Elzéar Goulet was officially opened on the eastern bank of the Red River, where Elzéar would have reached safety had he not been killed in the attempt. The Elzéar Goulet local of the Manitoba Métis Federation knew that I had written a song about him. I'd recorded it with my brother and uncle, both musicians, on one of my visits home, and Maman had played it for them. They flew me in from Unamagi to sing it at the opening ceremony. In the middle of the park, a low stone wall curves around the area where plaques tell his story, along with its significance in the history of my people and the founding of Manitoba. On the wall is etched a quote from my grandmother, Marie-Thérèse Goulet-Cruchen, who's also a well-known Métis writer. And it's a quote where she's describing her grandfather. Il fallait quelqu'un de très fort, quelqu'un qui connaissait les chevaux, un mécanicien et un réparateur né, quelqu'un de prudent et qui soit conscient de ses responsabilités, assurer la livraison de courriers et des bagages à travers de si grandes distances. Un homme de confiance qui soit le bienvenu au poste de relais qui était sur son chemin. Il devait faire preuve de modération et de ténacité. It took a person of great strength. He must know horses. He must be a born mechanic and repairman. He must be alert and conscious of his great charges. The delivery of papers and baggage throughout such great distances. He must be a trusted man, welcome at relay posts along the way. He must be temperate and enduring. Alzayar's many qualities written in stone. When the speeches were over, it was time to sing my song. I stood there by the river, flanked on either side by two of my brothers, my hair and the ribbons of my regalia blowing in the summer breeze, my mother and my oldest sister listening in the crowd. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. And I'm going to end playing that song. I love that we started with honoring the ancestors and we'll end with honoring the ancestors.
Took a trip to Winnipeg in the month of May. I wanted to walk where you ran that day. Found the old hotel on a street we both know well. And I walked in your footsteps. I walked your way. Right down to the river. Oh, so the story goes. Kicked off my shoes, got the mud between my toes. A light breeze was stirring in the warm spring air, and I offered to back there. As I watched the brown leaves float and flow beyond my side, I prayed that you would help me tell our story that night. Honor your spirit is all I want to do, as I owe so much of who I am to you. Surely did your part back then in the days of Riel to keep our nation strong. So many great ones fell, and I want to walk my own path, head held high and unafraid, to honor the choices that you made. I lingered by the river. Oh, I didn't want to leave. Took so long to find you, and my heart still needs to grieve. But the Métis Nation needs us today as it did then. And the path you cleared with courage calls again. Shone a light, grandfather, on this life that I live. So I'll walk back that to the here and now and see what I can do. When I meet you someday in the spirit world, you will recognize this Métis girl. Oh, recognize this Métis girl.
Presentation. Thank you so much, Marcy, for your kind attention.
We've got about 15 minutes for some questions, and we need to mic your questions so that it can go on the Zoom. So, any questions? Or are you just so overwhelmed? Oh,
Andrea, I just wanted to ask how old you were when you found out about your Métis heritage, and how did that
Okay,
occur?
I was 38, and I had gone back. No, I met my family when I was 38. So about a year before that, I was starting my master's in education and counseling at Acadia. And this was in 1995. And the internet was still new to some of us, including me, always a late adopter. And we had to do a compulsory at the beginning of the year. Part of our orientation was a computer sort of training in the computer lab at Acadia. And so we were being asked to scroll the web, like to look something up. And I started with the letter A, and I was like did they call them bulletin boards or something at that time? Anyway, it's all different now, but I just started with the letter A, and a bunch of topics came up, and I scrolled down to see what I wanted to look at, and there was Adoption Manitoba. So I clicked on that. I had already written in the 80s, I had written to Winnipeg Child and Family Services for my non-identifying information, because at that point, searches weren't done for birth parents. And there was this voluntary registry that I could have put my name on, and only if somebody in my birth family had put their name on would we connect. And I chose not to do it at that time because I wasn't prepared to take the risk that maybe nobody in my birth family was interested in meeting me. But I did get a bunch of non-identifying information with all kinds of things redacted. But the legislation had changed. That happened in the 90s, where I think recognizing the need for adoptees to know where we come from was starting to be understood. So I found out in the computer lab in that tutorial that I could now do an active search for my birth mother. And I went around the rest of the day in a daze. And I next time I was in Winnipeg, I went to the Child and Family Services office. You had to pay. I still have to pay. So I made the application, and my birth mother was quite easy to find. And partly because I was older when I did it, I think they put me closer to the top of the pile because, I mean, they had thousands of people wanting to do this, as you can imagine. But knowing that my birth mother would be older, they gave sort of a privileged or preferential treatment to people whose birth parents were likely to be older. Yeah.
Andrea, thanks so much for your talk and your singing. I may have missed it in the song, the Little Moccasin song, but what instructions did you receive among to come towards the east when you were as you say in the song, could have gone anywhere?
Yeah, I didn't receive any instructions. I mean, in Manitoba, growing up in Winnipeg, the East is Toronto.
Yeah.
You know, for really, really enlightened people, maybe Montreal, never Quebec City. And the Maritimes were simply not in the consciousness at all. They were like a complete unknown and mystery. And, you know, and in Manitoba growing up, everybody, like as teenagers, everybody that wanted to travel was also going west, right? This whole thing of going west. It's kind of in our psyches, I think. But so my older adoptive brother would say that I went east because I was contrary, but I prefer to think of it as an affinity with the underdog, which is part of the blood memory of my people. And I was really interested in checking out this place that nobody seemed to care about. And I ended up here and loved it. So came back to live.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was awesome. Can you tell me why you stayed here?
I had a child with a man who lives in Nova Scotia. And although we didn't live together to raise our son, I knew that, well, we were actively co-parenting. He was very committed and has been a great dad to our son. And I knew before we ever had a parenting agreement, which happened later on in Rowan's life, that I couldn't disrupt that relationship, that I had to honor Rowan's need to have his dad in his life. And actually, so I never got the chance to go back and live in Manitoba. So I've never actually lived in my cultural community, although I'm very connected to them now and to the broader community, as well as my own kinship, my own extended family. But now that my son is 25, I am now enacting a plan to live part-time in Manitoba and part-time here. In fact, one of my birth family brothers and I are going to buy some land together, and we're actually I have 3 brothers there, and they're all excited about this idea of having like a land that all of our family can come to and live on. And I was just at a Manitoba Métis Federation 60 Scoop gathering last weekend. And my brother Lindsay, who was also, I'm the youngest of 8 in that family. Lindsay was also adopted. When that first 5 of children of my siblings were apprehended, he was a baby. So he was adopted where the others went into foster care. And he was adopted into a white family in northern Manitoba that were ranchers. And he's now retired from ranching. And yeah, I overheard him telling somebody, you know, my sister and I are going to buy land together. You know, we never lived together as kids, and now we get to be together. So now I get to go back to my homeland now that my son is older. Yeah.
One is, do you see links between your Métis culture and the Nova Scotia culture that you're involved with now? I mean, do you see some similarities? And then I have a big, heavy question that's nothing to do with your book, but it's got to do with the future of the Indian Act.
I'm not sure that I can tackle that in a short period of time today, but I think it's great that you have that question about the Indian Act. I think it's very problematic, and even within our Indigenous communities, we're struggling and grappling with what to do about it, you know, because it does actually enshrine some rights as well as perpetuate a colonial relationship. So it's very complex, and but it's worth a whole other discussion or study, I think, the Indian Act. And now I forget the first question. Oh yeah, similarities between Métis and Mi'kmaq culture. There are quite a few similarities. So my background in terms of the Indigenous part of my heritage is Anishinaabe. specifically Soto, which is sometimes called Cree or the Plains Cree, because they were Anishinaabe people who moved from Northern Ontario into Manitoba to escape the encroaching colonization of those lands. And they became those Anishinaabe people lived so closely to Cree culture that they have elements of Cree. So William Prince, for instance, is from, some of you might know him, wonderful musician. He's from a reserve called Peguis First Nation, which is like an OG Cree, or Soto is another way to say it. And the languages, Mi'kmaq and Anishinaabe-Moan, are both Algonquin languages. So there's words that are very similar in the language. And there are certain elements that are similar in terms of spirituality, ceremony, smudging, the use of traditional medicines. There's some similarities and there's some real big distinctions. And I think it's really important. It's a great question because as we decolonize our thinking and our understanding of settler Indigenous relationships, we have to avoid pan-indigeneity. So whenever we say, I never say Indigenous people, singular, it's always peoples, because there's many distinct peoples, hundreds of distinct Indigenous peoples in Canada. So yeah, when I went to Wagelma to work, I had been connected to and really immersed in my culture for a number of years, about 5 years by then. And my birth mother was very involved in the Métis community. When I met her, her life had really, she'd done a lot of healing and a lot of changing in her life too. So she sent me tons of stuff about, what the Manitoba Métis Federation was doing and the politics and the history and the culture. And I was just really helped by my birth family to embrace all that. And I, of course, dove into it myself, as deeply as I could. However, when I went to Wagelma to work as the therapist there, I was really aware that I was coming into another culture. And I have to say that my life, for whatever reason, I feel like it's a path that Creator has put me on. And it's also, I think, my Métis blood memory that I have done a lot of interaction with different cultures and in some ways, sometimes been a bridge. But I think about my experience with For the Moment and getting to know the African Nova Scotian community really deeply over 20 years. And also I worked at Stepping Stone Street Outreach, and I consider that those years were an immersion into street culture, which is another culture. And I really learned from both of those experiences really important lessons that helped me in Wagelma, which was how important it is to know what you don't know, how you have to be courageous and humble enough to admit that, and how being able to come into relationship with people of another culture, carrying ourselves that way, makes us trustworthy. And once that has been established and there's that kind of deep respect, then the kinds of relationships that are possible are pretty profound. So yeah, so some similarities, but also some real differences that I had to really own and be aware of when I got to, really get to know Mi'kmaq culture and really be welcomed and become a part of that community. And I think I recognize you from Breaking the Silence, am I right? Yes.
And I've read your book. I should have started by
Oh.
saying that.
Nice to see you again.
We have time for one more question. It seems a little off the wall, but do you have any notion why people would adopt Métis kids or any kids if they were so hostile? It's very odd in my mind, and I just can never get my head around it. And I wondered if you had any insight at all.
I'm not sure, Gwen, but what I would say is that I think we understand childhood and children differently now than 64 years ago when I was adopted, because, I remember people saying that, you could uproot a child and relocate them and plant them somewhere else, anywhere in the first 5 years of life, and it wouldn't have an impact on them. It's almost as if like Eurocentric worldview so prioritizes cognitive rational thinking, right? So it was like children, if they aren't, yet if their cognitive development is not really there, so pre-verbal or children, toddlers, that if they can't understand it or don't have the language to process it, that it's not going to have an impact on them. So we have a completely different understanding of childhood now, and it's much closer to, the Indigenous worldview around the 4 aspects of the being: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, that are part of all of us. So, just the understanding that children, now we know even prenatally, children experience and the environment they're in, the environment their birth mother is in, has an impact on the child's development even before birth. So that's one piece, because I think that the prevalence of that kind of lack of understanding of children really converged with the assimilationist agenda of Canadian society and the Canadian government, which the federally kind of downloaded responsibility for child welfare onto the provinces. But I think that, I now know, looking back, that especially my birth mother was really racist. And I grew up in that kind of Canadian racism that is sort of subtle and maybe not so polite, but we like to think it is. I'm sorry, my adoptive mother. Thank you. Thank you for correcting me there. So I think that's the other piece, that they just expected that they could make us into white people, right? It wasn't like, even if they were racist, they thought they could change us so that they wouldn't have an Indigenous child. I mean, that was right? Especially like me, if you're white passing, right? So that's the best I can do with that one.
Andrea, thank you so very much for being with us today. I'm sure that everyone has gained insight, and probably more important, our desire to learn more. And I really appreciate that. On my part, I want to thank you so much for the talk about the concept of cultural blindness. I think that's really important, and it's just, there's so many light bulbs came on. And now I have a desire not to have moccasins anymore. But thank you very much for spending time with us. And I know all of us wish you all the best
Thank you so
in the
much.
world.
Thank you all.